So I started my own ministry last year called Convincing Proof, and it's just something that I do on the side. It's I'm still full-time Ratio Christi, but Convincing Proof with my website and my YouTube channel is a way that allows me to get my original content out there to try to serve people with the things that I'm creating. And I've started to use my middle name now that I'm doing stuff online and starting to write some books and get published and stuff. I find that there's a lot of Adam Johnsons out there. So I'm starting to use my middle name to kind of help people find me more easily. So yeah, convincingproof.org if you want to check it out. I try to put a lot of good resources, videos and articles and stuff that I've published out there, book ideas, so on and so forth. But I specialize both in my research over the years and my writing and speaking. I specialize in the moral argument. And I'm sure you guys have studied this and know kind of the basics of the moral argument. But let me just summarize it real quickly. This is a version of the moral argument that's very simplified, just kind of gets down to the brass tacks, two premises and then a conclusion, right? So premise one, there are objective moral truths, and then you have to defend that premise. And then premise two, the existence of God best explains how or why, how there could be such objective moral truths. The conclusion, therefore, is that we would then conclude that God does exist because he's the best explanation of these objective moral truths. So let me just run through the first premise real quick, because what I actually specialize in is the second premise. If you can believe, I spent 6-7 years working on a PhD on the second premise. You can spend that much time researching one premise in just one argument for theism or Christianity. First of all, what do we mean by objective moral truth? Sometimes it's easier for people to think through the opposite of something that is objective. And of course, the opposite of objective is subjective. So if moral truth was merely subjective, then it would be something only within us, right? It would be based on our own desires, feelings, choices, wills, opinions. It would be more of like a preference. Kind of like a preference for ice cream or a preference for different types of humor. It would be more of a subjective preference. Thus, relative by person, just like the favorite flavor of ice cream is relative per person, or maybe relative by culture. Moral relativism, in other words, is where it comes from subjective morality. Objective morality would be just the opposite then, right? So objective moral truth is making the claim, which we have to defend, that there are objective moral truths, but just the idea that there are objective moral truths is the idea that there are at least some truths about morality that exist somehow beyond our own personal preferences, desires, choices, wills, and opinions. For example, the objective moral truth that rape is wrong. And rape would still be wrong if somehow, let's say, a mad scientist put something in the drinking water or made us all take a pill tonight such that we woke up tomorrow morning thinking that rape was morally acceptable. That would not make rape okay, because the truth, rape is wrong, is an objective moral truth. It doesn't change based on what we think of it. It exists somehow objectively apart from us. So a well-known Christian philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, described it like this. Moral truths are objective in the sense that they are in a certain way independent of our human beliefs and desires. It's wrong to torture. So I use rape. Torture is another common one. It's wrong to torture someone for the fun of it, and would remain wrong even if most or all of the world's population came to believe that this behavior is acceptable. Now, we're not saying it's always easy to know what the objective moral truth is in a particular circumstance. It can be difficult to know what is morally correct. And we struggle with that. But that's not unique to the field of morality. We struggle to know what's objectively true in history, in the sciences, in math, my field before theology and philosophy. So the fact that we struggle sometimes knowing what is objectively morally true doesn't mean that there aren't moral truths that are objectively real. So I want to quickly move on to the second premise, because as I said, that's what I specialize in. So if there are objective moral truths, let's say, we spent more time defending that premise or maybe the person that we're engaging with gives us that premise. They agree that there are objective moral truths. Well, then the next step in the moral argument is to make the case that God is the best explanation of how there could be such objective moral truths. In other words, if there are objective moral truths out there, where do they come from? How can they exist apart from us? What's the source and foundation of these moral truths? As I said, this is where we're now discussing premise 2 of the moral argument, as I've laid it out here. Now, for centuries, thinkers in the West have mostly agreed that God is the best explanation for these objective moral truths. So you've got thinkers like Bagot and Walls. I won't read the quote here, you can take a look at it. But it's this sort of thinking that has led a lot of philosophers in the West down through the centuries to agree that God is the best explanation for how there could be objective moral truths. And not only thinkers from our Abrahamic religions. So the Abrahamic religions obviously would be Christianity, Islam, Judaism. Not only thinkers from the Abrahamic theistic belief systems, but also thinkers from other theistic belief systems have made the case that God is the best explanation for objective morality. Take, for instance, Plato. So Plato argued that since the physical world, including us, part of the physical world, is constantly changing, constantly in flux, it couldn't provide the fixed certainty required for objective truth, including moral truth. So Plato proposed the existence of these transcendent universal truths. Sometimes they're called Platonic forms or abstract objects, these universal truths that exist somehow in this transcendent realm. And he even, like a lot of these thinkers outside the Abrahamic religions, they even described the source of these objective moral truths, this transcendent source, in much the same way the Abrahamic religions described God. So for instance, Plato would talk about the good being the ultimate source of all of these universal truths, these forms, and even suggested that there was a divine craftsman that used all of these forms or universal truths from the transcendent realm in making our physical world. Interestingly enough, there have been a lot of atheists throughout history who have also affirmed this second premise. In other words, there have been many atheists, and I'll give you some examples here, who have said that if there are objective moral truths, then God is the best explanation for them. Probably the most famous of these atheists is none other than Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, we kind of know Nietzsche as the bad boy of philosophy, right? He's the guy who announced that God is dead. He is a well-known atheist and critic of God and Christianity. But interestingly enough, Nietzsche can be an unlikely ally in this conversation, because as you're probably reading the quotes already, many people have pointed out that Nietzsche was insightful in the sense that he recognized there couldn't be objective moral truths if there was no God. And as an atheist, since he believed that there was no God, he then concluded there could not be any objective moral truths. I mean, that's part and parcel of his whole moral theory, that there are no objective moral truths, and we all are in a struggle trying to push our own subjective morality on others, which is a big part of critical theory as well. Nietzschean in that sense, the will to power, using our power to enforce our subjective views of things. Now, Nietzsche is not the only one who agreed with this premise, the only atheist. We've got an atheist thinker, one of the founders of existentialism. So Jean-Paul Sartre said that, let me move over to my next page here. There can no longer be an a priori good, since there's no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it. If God does not exist, we find no values or commands to turn to which legitimize our conduct. So I'm just making the point here that a lot of atheists have agreed with the second premise. But there have been some atheists who have said, not so fast. Roll back the trolley. Maybe objective moral truths can exist even if there is no God. In other words, maybe objective moral truths don't need God as a foundation. Maybe objective moral truths can exist on their own somehow without a foundation. Now, one of these atheistic thinkers is G.E. Moore. So G.E. Moore, he has a well-known book he wrote in the early 20th century, 1903, Principia Ethica. And his work as an atheist, proposing this idea that objective moral truth can exist without a foundation, can exist without God, has had a huge impact on moral theory over the last 100 years. He made the case that objective morality exists on its own and therefore doesn't need God as a foundation. Now, interestingly enough, and this is what confuses a lot of people, he agreed that moral goodness, these objective moral truths, couldn't be explained naturalistically, okay? So he posited these moral truths as non-natural properties. In other words, he had rejected naturalism. He was more Platonic in that sense then, where he put forth, kind of like Plato, the idea that there are these universal truths that exist outside space, time, and matter in a transcendent realm, if you will, although he wouldn't say it that way, but they existed beyond the material universe. He wasn't a naturalist in that sense. He, like Plato, affirmed that there were these moral truths out there, kind of like as a lot of Platonic mathematicians think of numbers. So like the number 7 exists out there somehow, you know, apart from physical reality, or mathematical truths exist out there as truths that exist on their own. So even if the physical universe somehow disappeared, there would still be mathematical truths that would exist, or numbers, or truths of math like 2 + 2 = 4. They're non-natural, immaterial truths that exist. And he said moral truths were much like that. So a very Platonic understanding of these things. This Morean theory of morality has become very, very popular over the last 20 or 30 years. So you can see all the names here. There's all sorts of atheist academic philosophers who have embraced this sort of new atheistic position on objective morality. So all these guys, they argue that morality is just like we do. They argue for objective, absolute morality, which I'm very thankful for. However, they think that there can be objective moral truths even though there is no God. So you got somebody here like Russ Schaefer Landau, probably read that quote from him already. Another well-known one is David Enoch. He argues for objective moral truth. And look at this. I want to point out this quote. He said here, the second quote on the screen, I claimed in 2003, when I first defended this theory of objective moral truth, I claimed the great philosophical advantage of being in the ridiculed minority, putting forward a view of objective morality that many don't think is even worth considering. But this view is making an impressive comeback. And he even noted that Stephen Finley classifies this as the now dominant view. In other words, in the past, most atheists and most of the work that we were doing in this field was fighting against subjective morality, fighting against relative morality. But which is still very common at the popular level, but at the academic level, the majority of atheists have moved now to affirming objective absolute morality, which again, we can be thankful for, but they're still presenting it as an alternative or a competitor to theism, because they are proposing that these objective moral truths exist, even though God does not. Now, one of the key figures in this movement is Eric Wielenberg. And these atheists then, because they're, promoting their theory or their explanation of objective morality, they have to critique other theories that try to explain objective morality, one of them being theism or Christianity. So Wielenberg has become very well known for criticizing theistic explanations of objective morality. William Lane Craig wrote that Wielenberg has emerged as the most important contemporary critic of theistic metaethics. And metaethics is just the theory of where morality comes from. How can morality exist out there? That's metaethics. So Wielenberg, he calls his theory godless normative realism, just to make the point that he thinks that moral truths are objectively real, but that there is no God. So godless normative realism. Now, he's very much like G.E. Moore in that he's Platonic and proposes that there are these objective moral truths that exist out there. He calls them brute ethical facts. And I want to read to you his rather long explanation here so you can get a better idea of his theory. So he says, these brute ethical facts, these objective moral truths that exist out there, such facts are the foundation of the rest of objective morality, and they rest on no foundation themselves. So to ask of such facts, where do they come from or on what foundation do they rest, is misguided in much the same way that, according to theists, it's misguided to ask of God, where does he come from or on what foundation does God exist? The answer is the same in both cases. They come from nowhere, and nothing external to themselves grounds their existence. Rather, they are fundamental features of the universe that ground other truths. So he describes them as these abstract objects. As I said, a lot of people get confused at this point because, unfortunately, a lot of folks think of atheism and naturalism as the same thing. But these atheists, they're not naturalists. You can be an atheist without being a naturalist. So it's important to make this distinction. There are different forms of atheism. I mean, atheism basically is just the rejection of the existence of God, right? An atheist believes that there is no God. There are atheists who are naturalists. For example, Carl Sagan famously said, the cosmos, the universe is all that is, or all that was, or all that ever will be. So all he thinks that exists is the natural world, the material physical universe, and nothing exists beyond that. So he was an atheist who was a naturalist. But there are many atheists, and there's becoming more and more of them, that reject naturalism. In other words, they believe that there are things that exist beyond the physical material universe, but they still deny that there is a God. So they're still atheists. So I hope that makes a little bit more sense as to where these theories are coming from, or how they can still be atheists and propose that there are things that exist beyond the physical material universe. Now, I want to shift gears here a little bit, because we've been talking mostly about these atheistic theories that are becoming more and more popular, at least at the academic level, and they're starting to trickle down to the more popular level. But I want to shift gears and point out to you that just as there's been a rise or an increase in atheistic theories of objective morality, there's been a similar renaissance in theistic explanations of objective morality, or theistic metaethics. So I want to share with you some of these thinkers. One of them is John Hare. He played a large role in my dissertation and research. He has degrees from Oxford, Princeton. You can see where he served as a professor. And I want to point this quote out from him. He said, "No one looking at this discipline, moral theory, metaethics, no one looking at it in the late 60s when I was doing my training would have predicted the existence of this series." And in the context, he's talking about all these theists and Christians who are writing at the academic level, making a case that God is the best explanation for objective morality. Nobody predicted, all this research and writing and books that would have taken place when I was doing my training in the 60s. But these titles, the books that he was listing in this context, are a manifestation within ethical theory of a much larger shift within the discipline. Here's two other thinkers I wanted to point out to you real quick. Robert Adams, degrees, Princeton, Oxford, Cornell. He's taught pretty much everywhere. Yale, Oxford. He might even be still at Rutgers, or he might be retired, but he was a professor at Rutgers for a while. Stephen Evans is another one, degrees from Wheaton, Yale. He's currently at Baylor. So one of the reasons I share this with students is I want them to know they should not be embarrassed or feel insecure in their studies or in the university as they're writing papers, as they're making a case for theistic moral theories, because these sort of theories that propose that God is the best explanation for morality, these theories are being written and developed at the highest academic level. And probably couldn't quote your pastor, couldn't quote me if you're writing a university paper, but you could certainly quote Robert Adams. His academic credentials are out of this world. So there is work being done on the theistic side of things at the very highest of academic levels, and that should be encouraging to us as well. So I want to talk about some of these theistic theories of morality then. All Christians, for the most part, would agree that God is the ultimate foundation of morality, right? However, even within Christianity, there's disagreement as to how God is the foundation and source of morality. Is it through his commands? Is it by how he created human nature? Is it, somebody mentioned earlier, ideas in his mind? Is that where morality comes from? Is it from God's nature? Is it just through his sovereign will that he just chooses what's right and wrong? Or is God somehow himself the exemplar? Is God himself somehow the moral standard? How is it that God is the source and foundation of morality? The two most common theistic theories throughout history have been natural law and divine command theory. And these two theories are often presented as opponents, and they often have butted heads and fought against each other down through history. And they're not unique to Christian theism. A lot of theistic belief systems have very similar theories based on natural law or divine command theory. So let me just explain these two really quick, and then I'll move on because I want to present at least the basics of my own theory, which I call my divine love theory. But regardless of your theory, whether it's an atheistic theory or a theistic theory, every moral theory tries to explain two things: moral value on one hand and moral obligation on the other hand. Moral value is usually discussed in terms of something being good or bad. What makes something good? What makes something bad? Moral obligation, on the other hand, is usually discussed in terms of right and wrong. So what makes something right? What makes something wrong? What makes you have a certain duty or obligation to do something? Now, these two ideas, good and bad, right and wrong, moral value and moral obligation, there's a lot of overlap between these two ideas, but it's important to separate them. And I'll give you an example of why and how they can be separated and should be probably separated. For example, there could be something which is good, but not obligatory, okay? So it would be good, let's say, for me to build an orphanage, but most people would say that I'm not necessarily obligated to do that, right? It's a good thing to do, but I'm not obligated. I don't have to, I don't morally, there's not a moral should for me to do that. Whereas rape, refraining from rape would be something that is good. It's good to refrain from raping somebody, but I also have an obligation, right? I have a moral duty not to rape. So sometimes they overlap, sometimes they can be separated. So all moral theories try to explain both of these things: what makes something morally valuable and what makes something morally obligatory. So natural law, we won't spend much time on this, but just so you know, natural law is based on, it's a Christian theory of morality, which claims that both moral value and moral obligation is based on our human nature. So a natural law theorist is going to say what makes something right or wrong, or what makes something good or bad, is whether or not it leads to human flourishing based on how God created us as humans. So natural law is going to be very common among Thomistic thinkers, right? Classical theists are going to affirm natural law. Whereas divine command theory is usually presented as an opponent to natural law theory, but actually divine command theory on its own is merely a theory of moral obligation. So divine command theory basically just says that all of our obligations ultimately stem from God's commands. And they don't necessarily have to be like verbal, written out commands like the 10 Commandments, but just any way that God communicates moral truths to us. So our conscience, moral intuition, all sorts of general revelation, any way that God reveals moral truths to us would be considered a command under divine command theory. I don't like the name divine command theory, but that's the name this theory was given, and it's stuck, and it is what it is. But when people hear it, command, they just think of like direct verbal commands that God gives. But the theory goes much more beyond that. Any way that God communicates moral truths to us generates moral obligations. Divine command theory, though, doesn't have a theory of moral value. It's only a theory of moral obligation. So you can actually take, for instance, a natural law theory of a natural law theory of moral value and combine that with divine command theory. And some people have done that. Now, the most well-known divine command theory right now is Robert Adams, one of the gentlemen that I was talking to you about before, who has been a professor, might still be a professor at Rutgers. Robert Adams' divine command theory, he makes the case that it's a divine command theory. So he says our moral obligations come from divine commands. But he proposes then a theory of moral value and claims that something is morally good if it resembles God's moral nature. So some of you said this earlier, that it's God's nature, which is the source and foundation of morality. And Robert Adams would agree. His book, Finite and Infinite Goods, published by Oxford University Press, has really become the most well-known, most robust, most celebrated work in divine command theory over the last 30, 40 years. I think it was published in the late 90s. So Robert Adams' theory. I built my theory, so finally here now transitioning into my theory of morality, which I call my divine love theory. It's most similar to Robert Adams' theory, but I make one big difference. I make the case that the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity is the ultimate source and foundation of morality. So it's my theory of morality is based on the Trinity, that there are three divine persons within the Godhead, right? The Trinity is one being, three persons, and these loving relationships between these three divine persons is the source and foundation of morality. So in my theory, I also need to try to explain moral value and moral obligation. So I make the case that moral value, something is morally good if it resembles the love between the members of the Trinity. And then my moral obligation is similar to a divine command theory, but I say I start with this premise that God, because God should be loved, God should be loved. And because God should be loved, his commands generate our moral obligation. So that's my theory in a nutshell. And then what I've done, while I've developed my theory, I've tried to, like any theory, I've tried to show how it is the best explanation of morality, how it's the most plausible explanation. And I do that by showing how my theory explains so much. It makes so much sense of morality. It makes sense of why Jesus said that the greatest commandments were to love God and to love others. It makes sense as to why personal loving relationships are the most important things in our lives. So I try to show that my theory makes a lot of sense of the moral experiences that we have and have had in our lives. And then I take in a lot of my work, what I do is I take my theory, my divine love theory, and then I take Eric Wielenberg's godless normative realism, his atheistic theory, and I do a compare and contrast, making the argument that, and this is just the second premise of the moral argument, right? But I'm making the case that my divine love theory is a better explanation for objective morality than Eric Wielenberg's atheistic moral theory, since his is one of the ones that's the most popular and he's the most vocal about attacking theistic moral theories. So that was what my dissertation was on. That's what I speak on a lot, criticizing his moral theory, showing how it doesn't make good plausible sense, how it doesn't explain the things that my theory does explain about moral reality. And that's the sort of stuff that I specialize in. I'll fast forward to the end of my slides where I give some of my resources that I try to produce and serve others with. So my book with William Lane Craig came out, I think 2 years ago now, a year and a half maybe. But I coordinated and moderated a debate between William Lane Craig and Eric Wielenberg, who I've been discussing tonight. And then I was the moderator of the debate. We had it at NC State in 2018. About 1,200 people showed up. And this book is based on that debate. I wrote the first chapter in the book, and then we had several atheist philosophers and several Christian philosophers write chapters responding to the debate. And then we brought Eric Wielenberg to the University of Nebraska to have a discussion debate with me We did that last year. And then my book on my divine love theory is coming out through Kregel publications, hopefully next year. But you can, in the meantime, you can check out my website, like I said, convincingproof.org. And that's where I try to put all of my, videos and articles and things that I'm working on to serve other people with. So back to that slide of, these different theistic theories of how God is the best explanation of morality. So my theory would encompass a few of these, right? So I would affirm that it is his moral nature, his Trinitarian moral nature, if you will, is the exemplar or is the ultimate standard of morality. So that if God, the Trinitarian relationships, the love between the members of the Trinity, his Trinitarian nature, those loving relationships is the standard. So when we imitate that or resemble that or reflect that, then we are good. If God is the good, and this is what Robert Adams would say as well, but he would just talk generally about God's nature. And when we resemble God's nature, then we are morally good because he is the ultimate standard of goodness. And I'm just drilling down more into God's nature and specifically pointing out that it is those loving relationships within God's nature that is the thing that we're imitating when we're morally good. So the love between the members of the Trinity is the ultimate good. And when, therefore, we are loving, we are morally good because we're imitating the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity. So sometimes, and I see where you're kind of getting at with the incarnation, sometimes Christians will push back on me and say, well, man, it seems like the relationships between the members of the Trinity, God is so completely different than human beings, right? So you got divine persons and you got human persons, and we're so different. How could we ever resemble God? Because he's so different than us. I mean, a lot of our morality, if you think about it, a lot of our morality has to do with life and death, has to do with pain and suffering, has to do with sexual things. And none of that really would apply to God at all, right? Because he's not a sexual being. He can't be harmed or murdered, right? So how can we resemble God in that sense? And this is where I draw on some things from the natural law theorists. I don't completely dismiss natural law. I don't think it works as the ultimate theory of morality, but I think there's some insights within natural law, and I try to incorporate them into my theory. And I say, the human nature that God created us with is very important. And I'm going to go fast forward to a slide here where I discuss this, because I think it'll be helpful if you see it. So yeah, think of two situations. Think of a human being, me, let's say, protecting an innocent person from murder. Or scenario two, think of me, a human being murdering an innocent human being, right? We would say one is morally good and two is morally bad. But how can this resemble the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity? Because God, couldn't murder, he can't die. So how does it connect? How can it resemble? And this is where it's important to think about human nature. And this is insights that I bring in from natural law, that it's very important to understand how God created us, our human nature, because he created us in such a way that some things that we do to each other because of the way he made us, because of the way he made human nature, some things that we do to each other are unloving, and some things that we do towards each other are loving based on the way he created us. I mean, think about it this way. He could have created us with a different nature. In other words, he could have created us such that if I murdered someone, they would find it a very pleasurable experience and they would come back to life 10 seconds later. I know that's kind of a silly thought experiment, but God could have created us with that sort of nature, right? He didn't. But if he would have created us that way, then murdering somebody would actually be a loving thing to do, not an unloving thing to do. So it is important to take into consideration the human nature and how he created us to be as human beings. So it's not the killing or the protecting somebody from a murderer that can resemble, but it's either the lovingness of the action or the unlovingness of the action that can reflect the loving relationships in between the members of the Trinity. So it's the loving or unloving aspect of the action that can reflect. And that's why, to your point, the incarnation is such a beautiful thing and so informative to us, because in the incarnation, Jesus was able to not only tell us, but show us how to love, given our human nature is the way that it is. Given that he made us in this way, he didn't make us with an angelic nature or a feline nature. He made us with a human nature. And based on that, here is how we can love each other. But it's the loving each other that can resemble or not resemble, if we don't love, the relationships between the members of the Trinity. And a lot of my, we won't go there, but just for reference, a lot of my understanding of the loving relationship between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit comes from John 17. So those are some of the verses that I guess led me to this conclusion about these loving relationships between the members of the Trinity. I've got to be really careful using that term love, because first of all, language is fluid, right? We all know that. The meaning of words change over time. Cool used to just mean, kind of chilly and cold, but now cool is mostly used to talk about something that's hip or in fashion, right? So language changes, terms change, whether we like it or not. I mean, truth is absolute, language isn't, language is fluid. And the term love has taken on so many different meanings and definitions as of late that, in my theory, if I'm calling my theory divine love theory and talking about love, I've got to be very careful and explain what I mean when I'm using that term, because a lot of people, as you pointed out, are using that term in ways that I don't want to mean, right? That love is more of a subjective, emotional thing. And we're saying just the opposite, that love is objective. So as I try to explain, first of all, what is love in the Trinity? So if I, some of these verses that I base my theory on, John 17, Jesus is talking about the love between him and the Father before the foundation of the earth. What is Jesus talking about? How can divine persons love each other? And so there's a lot of Trinitarian work that I had to, go through the history of understanding the Trinity and what does it mean to be a divine person, and can a divine person love another divine person? I mean, that seems almost too human in a sense. But Jesus said, him and the Father had a loving relationship before the foundation of the world. So we can't just dismiss that. And so I've gone through a lot of theologians, both past and present, to try to understand that better. What does love look like, or what is love between the members of the Trinity? And one of the quotes that I use often is from Millard Erickson here, as he describes this Trinitarian love as the attractive force of unselfish concern for another person. And it involves emotions, obviously, but it's the putting the other person first. There's humility involved. And if God really is the source of everything, if he is the uncaused cause, if everything comes from him, this is one of the reasons I love the movie Interstellar. And if you've seen Christopher Nolan's movie Interstellar, but they're struggling with this idea in the movie that love is real, but they don't have an explanation for it. And I like whenever I watch that movie, I want to scream to the characters, Anne Hathaway and Matthew McConaughey. I want to scream to them and say, we've got Christianity. We have an explanation for how love can be real. Because if God exists and he created everything, then, and there's loving relationships between the members of the Trinity, then love is part of ultimate reality. And so it's not a coincidence, or it's not a mistake that love is so important to us. And love is I would say, the most important thing about our lives, our meaningful, loving, personal relationships. And it's because ultimate reality is love. God is love. the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity. And from him flows all other aspects of reality, including us. So we have an explanation as to how love can be real because it's part of ultimate reality, God. Commands or divine command theory or just commands from God in general get a bad rap because it kind of makes God seem like this dictatorial, authoritarian, just obey my commands. I'm giving you, you've got to obey me, and kind of this ruler, this harsh, people just giving commands usually is not a nice thing often. But if you understand God's commands as giving us instruction to how to be the best loving person we can be, that they're actually a path for us to join the fellowship of the Trinity. I think that's what we were created for, based on John 17, that we were created to join the fellowship of the love within the Trinity. And then his commands, if we understand our purpose and why he created us, then his commands that way, then his commands are instructions for how to be the best lover possible, to how to be the best friend of God possible, to how to fulfill the greatest commandments, to love God and to love others. So if you understand God's commands more in that context, it kind of takes the bite out of them that a lot of people try to paint God's commands in a negative light.